My name is Mabel Jimenez. I'm an independent photographer and sometimes reporter, and you can mostly find my work at El Tecolote newspaper. It's a bilingual newspaper out of the Mission District. And sorry, I have my notes, my note helper, because I have to hold both hands. So I happened to grow up in the town of Tijuana, which is a town on the border, and growing up, migration was part of everyday life. People cross the border every single day in both directions to go to work, to go to school, to shop, to have fun, to visit, just to live your life. So it's very strange right now to see that immigration is being built into this crisis. That we're taking something as natural as the human right to migrate and created a crisis out of it. Earlier this year, I had a chance to visit Tijuana after not having been there for more than 10 years. And the biggest change there was that Tijuana is no longer a stopover town where people just come through on their way to the United States. Tijuana has become a purgatory of migration, of people, refugees that can't enter the United States, and they also can't go back to their countries of origin. And they're forced, they're stuck. And when I visited last February, there were 6,000 refugees in Tijuana who are stuck. Just a few months later, today, there are 10,000 refugees who cannot enter the United States, who are far away from home. 10,000 refugees just in one border town. There are about 25 shelters in Tijuana, 25 shelters for migrants and deportees. And all of these places are at capacity. I visited 13 of these shelters earlier this year. They have to turn people away. They're running out of food. None of these shelters down there are run by government. They're all run by either clergy or by everyday people just like you who just want to do what's right. Most of these people do not get paid for the work that they do, just like you're not getting paid to be here today. Just like Tijuana is a city of immigrants, San Francisco is a city of immigrants. And we live in a country of immigrants. So thank you so much for standing in solidarity with us. I'm so happy to see so many members of the press that are out here putting themselves out, opening themselves up for criticism, criticizing us because we're out here stating our opinions. Those of us who went to journalism school as students, we were told over and over, you have to be neutral. You have to be objective. You cannot express your opinion, and you should not be out protesting. There is a time and there is a place for neutrality. But right now, it's an emergency. Right now, it's time to speak up.
Yes. Did you change the case next? Thank you, Liz.
And speaking about objectivity, there are some colleagues who can't be here today because they would risk their jobs. As journalists, they would risk their jobs if they're out here protesting with us. So I want to acknowledge that there are people who couldn't be here because they have to sacrifice their right to express their opinion publicly so that they can continue doing the important work of bringing information to us. And I know that there's a lot of these colleagues that are here in spirit with us. And I do want to send a message to them, to those people who can't come out, who would risk their jobs by coming out here. I want to tell them that they're here with us in spirit, and we see them, and we appreciate their sacrifice. And I know you do too. We keep talking about this issue as something that's happening at the border, as something that's happening over there. But it's not. It's happening right here. It's happening on this block. It's happening in that building. It's happening in the kitchens and the restaurants nearby. It's happening to the families of the kids that your children go to school with. It's happening to the people that you sit next to on the bus. It's happening to your neighbors. They say that neutrality is basically minding your own business. Well, when my friends are afraid to go outside, it becomes our business. When our neighbors are too scared to go to work, it becomes our business. This event is called Journalists Against Detention Camps, but we're here to fight much more than that. We're here to fight raids. We're here to fight family separations. We're here to fight a whole immigration system that is completely broken. And all of these things, they're just a symptom of a bigger problem. In our country, our whole history is built on racism, on exploitation, on slavery, on fear. So we can't fight detention camps if we don't fight racism. We can't fight family separations. We can't fight raids if we're not also fighting the root cause of this, racism. And it's on us to educate each other, to educate our families, to have those difficult conversations. The work being outside out here is really important, but the work you do with your families and your loved ones and your coworkers behind closed doors is just as important.
You flip it one more time, please? Almost done.
And with that, I want to introduce to you just a few people that have come out and agreed to share some of their perspective with us and some of their work with us. The first people I want to introduce, Ella, I want to make sure I say your name correctly, Ella Banerjee. Ella Banerjee from Voice of Witness. She's going to be reading us some excerpts from a book called Solito, Solita, which are some stories about youth traveling alone to cross the border. So let's give it up for Ella.
I can hold this if you like. If you need to hold the both. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so.
Oh, I got it.
Thank you. Should I hold this down too?
No, just put it really close to you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for having us. My name is Ella Banerjee, and I'm from Voice of Witness. We're an organization in the mission. We publish oral history books about human rights and social justice issues. We believe that in addition to the great work that journalists do, it's really important to listen directly to the people impacted by these issues. And so we have a book that came out in April called Solito Solita, Crossing Borders with Youth Refugees from Central America. It contains 15 first-person narratives of young people who have crossed the border, escaping violence, poverty, severe conditions, fleeing for their lives, trying to find asylum here in the United States. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a young woman named Noemi, who's from Guatemala, who crossed when she was 16 years old, who's part of an indigenous community, and I'm really privileged to read her story, and you'll hear more about why she came to the U.S. and the really severe conditions she experienced at the hands of the U.S. government when she arrived here. And I want to acknowledge that Noemi spoke to us in her second language.
Sorry, turn it around. Let's try it again. Really close to you.
Hello, okay. And I want to acknowledge that Noemi spoke to us in Spanish, which is actually her second language after her native mom language, an indigenous language. So this is Noemi's story. I'll tell you, the place where I used to live was very beautiful. There were many trees and animals, little birds, rivers, and a lake that passed near my house. It was very green, and the little birds would start to sing when the rain stopped. Sometimes it was also foggy and cold. There were plantations of potato and corn, a little bit of everything. The landscape in Guatemala is beautiful, but it was not safe to live there. Growing up, I always loved nature. My father would teach me about how to use the plants as medicine. For example, there's a really tall tree called the eucalyptus. It was very beautiful. I wonder if they're still there. We would collect its leaves, boil them in water, and drink the tea to cure stomach pains. One night, strangers from the other village came to our village, beat my father badly, and threatened to kill him. They cut him on the legs with knives. There were a lot of men attacking him. He couldn't defend himself. I didn't see this happen, but I saw him right after when he was all bloody. I was about 8 years old at the time, and I don't remember the incident very well. My mom was also physically attacked when she tried to defend him. They punched her and threatened her. The attackers were Ladinos who spoke Spanish well. She was terrified after that and wanted to flee. That's why they came to the United States and left us in the care of our grandmother. I remember living in my grandmother's house. It was made of brick with a sheet metal roof and an indoor kitchen. There were just one bedroom, and my grandmother and grandfather, my two siblings, and me, 5 of us at any one time. We all shared it. We were really young when my parents left us in 2004. I was 8 years old. My little brother Alberto was 7, and my little sister Glacia was 6 years old. At that age, I didn't understand why my father had to go, but I do remember what he told me when he left. I'm going to the other side to send you something, send you money so you can have the best life. It wasn't like he could say, don't worry, I'm with you. The fighting over water and land continued after my parents were gone for the next several years as I was growing up. When the shooting would start, we'd run away to sleep in other people's houses, and my grandmother, because she was already old, couldn't defend us. One day they were shooting at the house where we used to live, and we, my grandmother's siblings and I, ran and took refuge in another house for a week. That time they killed a man. I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I went to his funeral. We came back home after a week. They would fight every week, every month. There was no day when they did not fight. I was really afraid for myself and for my siblings. I was now about 16 years old, and my brother was about 15. They threatened him, so he had to flee to the United States. That left my grandmother, my sister, and me alone. They burned down our house and shot at us. They poured gasoline on the house and lit it with a match. I don't know if they were Mexican drug traffickers or men from the other town. They wear masks. They had come twice before and attacked my grandmother once. When they came to the house the second time, she tried to escape but fell when she was running, and they beat her. My uncles told me about it. They came at night and she couldn't run fast enough. The night they set our house on fire, my sister and I fled and hid with our abuelita in the woods. The bullets didn't reach us. From where we were hiding, we could only see the smoke rising up above our house. The woods were filled with smoke. It didn't matter to them that we were children. They wanted to hurt us, kill us. In the 3 months that they were threatening my grandmother, many people were killed in the fighting. Because we didn't want to join the fighting, I grabbed my little sister and we ran to a mountain far away from there so they couldn't catch us. My grandmother was too old to run with us. We kept running for about 45 minutes and then we hid in the mountains. We slept in a barn where the goats and sheep slept. I was really afraid, especially for my sister because she was a bit younger. After hiding for 2 days, we came back to our grandmother's house. The people had stopped fighting and we stayed with my grandmother. We stayed with my grandmother for about 2 months. We were in a very difficult situation because the group kept threatening to kill our parents if they came back. So my sister and I decided to go live with them in the United States. I told my grandmother, Abuelita, we've got to get out of here. At first she didn't want us to leave, but then she raised her gray head and said, fine, go. It's for the best so those people don't do you any harm. At that time, I was about 16 and my sister was maybe 14. I'd only attended school until 5th grade. I'd worked in the village and saved up some money for the journey with my sister. We didn't tell our parents we were coming to America. So we came with these coyotes. We walked for 2 days from Guatemala to Mexico. They put us in bands like 10 people at a time. We were traveling in a group of around 30 people. It was dangerous, really unpleasant. Sometimes people didn't give us food. We would go 1 or 2 days without eating. Sometimes we slept for 2 or 3 hours and they woke us up to follow them. They didn't say anything to us. Over the whole trip, we showered once a week. The coyotes abandoned us in the desert somewhere near the Mexico-US border. After 2 days of walking without food or water, we heard the engines of an airplane nearby in the middle of the night. My sister and I hid ourselves at the foot of a hill so they wouldn't find us. In the darkness, I heard yelling that if we didn't come out, they were going to let the dogs out to find us. I think the coyotes might have known the immigration agents were coming, but I don't know. When the agents came, I actually felt happy because I didn't want to suffer more after being lost for 2 days and 2 nights without water. My sister and I were crying the whole time. When the agents caught us, I felt like they were rescuing us. So they brought us to the icebox in McAllen, Texas. Sometimes we were cold, hungry, it was really unpleasant. Sometimes all my sister and I wanted was to be with our mom and our dad. It was a huge sacrifice for us and we suffered a lot to come to this country. La Migra held us for 15 days. Sometimes they didn't give us food, sometimes we didn't sleep. There were around 50 people with us in the icebox in McAllen. Like all the people who come here, we suffered and endured a lot of things. When I spoke with the male immigration agent for the first time, he asked me my age. I wasn't sure how old I was. The agent told me that they were going to deport us. I was very scared and sad because I thought they were going to take us back to Guatemala. There were around 10 kids with us, a lot of people packed in this small room. They were all 12, 13, 14 years old, all girls more or less the same age. My sister and I didn't know any of the other people. Everyone was crying because they told all of us that we would be deported to our countries. They gave us a thin mattress to lie on, but no blanket. The floor was cement and cold. They kept the lights on the whole time. At one point, they tossed some cookies and orange juice into the room. A male immigration officer later said to us, "You're going back to your country." I started to cry, and I thought, this is the end because they've already caught us and they will send us back to Guatemala. So that was just an excerpt of Noemi's story. I'm happy to say that she is safely, has received asylum and is in Boston right now with her family. But I think this just shows the extreme suffering that people are trying to escape from, what they're experiencing when they arrive here in the U.S. after going through a terrible journey. They're receiving such cruelty by the hands of our government. So thank you so much for listening to Noemi's story.
Next, I want to have Steve Seltzer. He's the host of Work Week at KPFA, and he's both protesting and documenting with us today.
Every journalist in America should be on this, because this isn't just about the terrorism, the torture of migrants. This is about the destruction of any democracy in this country. This is about the destruction of our lives, all our lives. You know, there's a saying, you know, first they came for the communists. I didn't do anything because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Christians and the Social Democrats. I wasn't a Social Democrat. We're facing the same thing today. One of the things about journalists is we do try to tell the truth. Most journalists, not all. And when we try to tell the truth and we are whistleblowers, what do? They put us in jail, like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. They are in prison today because they told the truth, or they published the truth, about the crimes of the United States, about the illegal wars in Central America, about the illegal wars in Iraq, and the massacre of journalists, the massacre of civilians. Why are people driven to this country? Why are people driven to this country? It's because of the policies of U.S. imperialism. It was the invasion of Vietnam that forced Vietnamese to come to this country. It was the invasion of many countries, Guatemala, or the coup in Guatemala, that led people to leave that country. These migrants, these people around the world who are driven to this country because of the economic policies of the United States, or because of NAFTA, which destroyed the ejidos in Mexico, that forced the farmers to come to this country. The poor people, the working people are driven here, and then when they get here, what happens? They get blamed by this government for unemployment. They get blamed for the economic crisis. No! The immigrants in this country are not responsible for the economic crisis in this country. It's the corporations, it's the multinationals that are responsible for that. They want to exploit people who don't have unions. They want people terrorized so they'll work for slave labor wages. That's what these corporations want, and that's what they've done. And the history of the United States, the history of California, during the Depression, 500,000 Mexicans and Americans were deported from Los Angeles. What was that about? Were they the fault of the economic depression? No. So we also have to look today at the role of the corporations which run media in the United States, because their hands are bloody. These are the corporations that said we should invade Iraq. These are the corporations that put out the propaganda. And these are the corporations that tell the journalists, you cannot picket, you cannot protest, you cannot speak up. At the San Francisco Chronicle, journalists are warned that if they go out in a rally for women, if they go out in an anti-war rally, they will be fired. They'll be disciplined, and that's why they're terrorized. I don't believe in the idea of objectivity of these corporations. The Chronicle, Examiner, these ABC, NBC, Fox, they have their line, their political line. And if journalists don't follow that line, they get fired. What journalists have been fired? And there have been journalists who have defended Palestinians. That's crossing the line for these corporations. If you really expose what is going on, if you connect the dots, you become the enemy in this country. And for journalists, that means you lose your jobs. So I say at this rally today, journalists in the union, I'm a member of the Pacific Media Workers Guild, the freelance unit, have to start fighting for our rights to speak out. We have to fight against these corporations who tell us we don't have a right to speak out. The NUJ, the journalists in England, journalists around the world are speaking out for Julian Assange and demanding that he be free. The journalist union, the CWA, has to take the same stand. This is not, again, just about journalists. It's not, again, about migrants. It's the right of all working people to have freedom of speech, to fight the attacks that we're facing. When they put these children and people in prison, that's an attack on all of us. That's an attack on all of us. And the crimes, the torture of these children, they're war crimes. These people should be prosecuted criminally for what they're doing, tearing the children from their mothers. It's illegal, and we need a movement in this country of working people to defend the rights of immigrants, migrants, and all working people. Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Next, I want to introduce someone that you're probably already very familiar with. He ran for mayor back in 2015, I believe. He is the editor-in-chief of the Broke Ass Stewart website, and he's also a columnist for the San Francisco Examiner. Thank you so much for being here, Stewart.
Thanks for having me. All right. Yeah, please. When I say fuck, you say ice. Fuck. Ice. Fuck. Ice. When I say chinga, you say la migra. Chinga. La migra. Chinga. La migra. Yeah, all right. Here. This side? This side? Here? All right, cool. So I'm lucky in the fact that I don't really have to be objective because I wouldn't be good at that anyways. I'm lucky that I can say what I want, and so I often write what I want. So I'm going to read you a story I wrote for the San Francisco Examiner. It's a very subtle headline. It's called, "If you support the detention camps, you're a bad person." Driving down Interstate 10 towards the hotel, I could see the border wall running alongside the Rio Grande. It seemed to trail off into the distance further than last time I'd been in town, but that could just be because I wasn't paying as much attention. This was not my first time in El Paso. My grandma, my mom, my brother were all born there, and I'd lived there from ages 2 to age 7. Since moving to California in the 80s, I'd been back at least once a year, but this time might be my last. I'd flown to El Paso to bury my grandma, our matriarch, and like most of my family now and living in California, there won't be much of a reason to go back. El Paso is the ultimate border town. Until recently, people talked about the El Paso and Juarez region as a singular place. But after the cartel wars in the 2000s, things changed. The fluidity of the border tightened, and many Americans stopped going over. Now El Paso, where the fuck did this thing go? Now El Paso, keeps moving, sorry. It's a shitty website. All right. Now El Paso is making headlines for a different reason. Thousands of immigrants fleeing horrific circumstances are ending up in internment camps there. The conditions are inhumane. Children are being taken from their parents and held in savage conditions, while Fox News and Trump convince the right that this is just punishment for parents fleeing massacres of war. Sitting on my grandma's living room floor with my family, sifting through boxes of old photos, postcards, letters, and ephemera going back over 100 years, I started thinking about my own family's immigrant story and how we came to be Jews from El Paso. My great-grandfather, Lazar Kapilowicz, was born in Pokroy, Lithuania, a small Jewish shtetl that was part of Tsarist Russia. Tired of the terror of Cossacks and pogroms and fearing conscription into the Russian army to fight in World War I, he took what money he had and began walking east. He ended up walking all the way east, eventually taking a boat to Japan, and from there to Hawaii, ultimately landing here in San Francisco on November 1st, 1915. One of his first jobs in America was helping to dismantle the Panama Pacific International Exposition. His other job was working as a busboy for $15 plus month. Eat a dick, motherfucker! $15 a month plus room and board. Lazar eventually saved enough money to go to New Jersey, where he worked in a relative's candy store and learned English. Once in the U.S. Army, he joined the war and found himself. He joined the Army, and he, ironically, was in that, considering he was trying to get out of the Russian Army to begin with. But in the Army, he contracted tuberculosis, and since this was 1919, the best treatment they had was for him to go live someplace warm and work outside. So he left the East Coast, went to New Mexico. Before he did so, he was before the Supreme Court and naturalized a U.S. citizen, along with other foreign nationals who'd served in the Army. That's how it was to become a citizen back then. You just joined the Army. I'm telling you this to make a point. But before that, I want to give you a very truncated version of the rest of the story. Lazar ended up staying in the Southwest. In 1921, he brought over his childhood sweetheart, Lillian, who was my great-grandmother. And shortly afterwards, they began a goat farm in Deming, New Mexico. Realizing they wanted to raise their family around other Jews, they moved the goat farm to El Paso, where there was a rabbi and a congregation. They had 3 daughters, one of them who was my grandmother, and of the 3 girls, 2 married men who came to work at the farm. By the time they sold the dairy in the 70s, it was one of the biggest dairies in the Southwest. Lazar Kapilowicz had achieved the American dream. My great-grandfather's story is a remarkable one, but it's not unique. This is a country founded by immigrants. And those of us who had the privilege of being born here grew up hearing stories about the sacrifices and journeys our ancestors made to create a better life. And this is the part I can't seem to wrap my head around. During the days I was in El Paso, I talked to other people whose family migration stories were similar. They began with fleeing persecution and violence. Yet some of these people still somehow supported the camps. As we were grieving, I was on my best behavior. So I followed the golden rule of don't start no shit, won't be no shit. But I wanted to take a moment to address this now. Let me be clear and unequivocal. There is no argument you can make that justifies separating children from their parents. There is no argument you can make that justifies depriving people of basic human dignity. Those of you out there saying they are criminals because they came here illegally are misinformed. The vast majority of the people coming across the border are seeking asylum because they are fleeing violence in Central America. This is not illegal. The United Nations Universal Declaration Act Human Rights says everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Just like my great-grandfather, these people are leaving untenable situations because they have no choice. Think about it like this. How bad would things have to get for you to leave everything you know behind and show up in another country without a goddamn thing to your name?
Pretty fucking bad.
Those of you saying, well, it was worse under Obama, are also misinformed. While it's true there was more deportations under the Obama administration, it was Trump's senior policy advisor, Stephen Miller, who came up with the zero-tolerance policy that separates families at the border. Regardless, it's a stupid argument anyways. It's okay to do it because the other guy did it is a weak-ass excuse for putting children in subhuman conditions.
Yeah. That's support.
Thank you.
I don't know.
All right, sure.
I don't know if that was supportive or not.
Those of you saying they should do it the right way like my family did are not only misinformed, you're arguing in bad faith. I know for a fact that my great-grandfather became a legal citizen because we found his naturalization papers when clearing out my grandma's stuff. How many of you argue they should do it the right way like my family did can say the same thing? How many of you have the paperwork proving your ancestors came here and became legal citizens? Do you have the name of the boat they came in on? How about the port? The thing is, none of that actually matters because there's a very good chance that when your ancestors showed up, we didn't really have a right way. Congress did not pass the National Origins Act until 1924. Before that, you could just show up, and if you weren't diseased, and you weren't a Jew, and you weren't Chinese, they let you in. The idea of illegal immigrants is actually a relatively new concept in our country. But even that shouldn't matter considering that the United States committed genocide against Native Americans just to get this goddamn land. What I'm getting at is this. The camps at the border are not only unjust, they are evil. There is not a single good argument that can prove otherwise. If you support them, you're a bad person. My great-grandfather came to the United States because otherwise he would have been killed. There's a good chance that your ancestors came here for the same reason. How can you deny the opportunity to someone fleeing something equally horrific and still be considered a good person? The answer is, you can't.
Stuart, I have one more person that I want to introduce. He's my dear friend and colleague. We went to journalism school together and we worked at a Tecolote together for many years. So it means a lot to me to introduce my friend and colleague Alexis Terrazas. He's the editor-in-chief of El Tecolote newspaper.
So shout out again to Mabel. Shout out again to Mabel. This is the actually issue that. Hello? Yeah, there you go. Shout out again to Mabel. This is actually the front page of the entire issue that she reported on. We got copies if you want it, but I didn't really draft anything. I got babies, and in journalism school they tell you to distance yourself from that story, right? To kill the emotional human being, any kind of connection you have, to put that aside and to simply report. And I am incapable of doing that, especially now. Especially now. I got twin babies at home that I get to go home to every single day. I get to hold them. I get to laugh with them. And there's so many families right now that are being deprived of that very thing that I take for granted, that I'm, again, trying to not take for granted anymore. Mabel and I have covered reunification stories. Anybody that, and Broke-Ass Stewart kind of really eloquently put it this way, anybody who tries to argue and rationalize that these camps are needed, or that separating families is something that is necessary, needs to see a reunification. It touches something in your soul. Even as a journalist, Mabel interviewed, she didn't talk about this, but she interviewed a young man who was in detention while she was down here in San Diego, Tijuana, reporting on a story. When that young man was released, he was reunited with his family at a clinic here in the Mission District. Mabel let me know, and I was there to shoot and document that recovery. I didn't adequately prepare myself for that experience. I was shaken, and I'm still shaken. Seeing the love between a mother who hadn't seen her son in months does something to you. And I guess I'll end with this. I have journalism heroes. One of them is William Monroe Trotter. I don't know if many people know that name. He was a black journalist who founded the Boston newspaper, The Guardian, in the early 1900s. Anybody who is familiar with the history of this country knows that for black people, even in the early 1900s, even in Boston, northern Boston, life was difficult. That was around the time that this movie came out, Birth of a Nation. Anybody who knows that movie, I suggest you look it up. D.W. Griffith directed it. It was a movie that basically told a romanticized version of the founding of this history, one that elevated the Ku Klux Klan to basically like hero worship. Trotter, being the editor of this black newspaper, organized protests like this, calling for the boycott of this movie to not be shown in theaters around Boston, because when it was being shown around theaters in this country, massive race riots were basically orchestrated. And I even struggled to even call it that, race riots. They weren't race riots, they were lynch mobs, where black people were killed after being motivated by this false rhetoric. Trotter was unsuccessful. Those protests were unsuccessful, and those screenings, that movie was eventually shown in Boston, and guess what? Violence happened. And we cannot be unsuccessful here today. These protests have to work. We cannot afford to fail here, because the trauma that is being inflicted upon these innocent youth and families is going to take generations to recover from. And I just hope that one day, when my babies are old, they get to look back on all of our bylines. Every journalist that is standing here, they could look back at our bylines and say, you know what, they did not remain quiet. They did not remain objective. They did not remain neutral. They stood up and spoke up. And that's really all I have to say. So, gracias, Mabel. Gracias, everybody that did this thing. Going off or shit. We'll stop there.
Hey, can you do me a favor? Before you walk out, I just need a hand. Can you hold this for me? I have one more. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lex. It's been great working with you and covering these issues together, and I'm going to go to the other side. And now to go from sharing a newsroom to sharing this act of protest with you guys means a lot to us, and I hope it means a lot to you. We're reaching the end of the hour, but before we kind of close off today, I want to reframe this conversation a little bit, because we tend to think that talking about immigration is talking about politics, or it's talking about laws, and I think we're looking at it the wrong way. I think we need to have a conversation about compassion and a conversation about humanity. You know, fearing for your life is not a political stance. Having an empty stomach is not a political opinion. This is just part of being human. If there's people out there listening to us who thinks that everybody should wait in line, you should know that this line that we're supposed to wait on is completely disregarded by our government, and it is rarely a viable option for people who are fleeing for their lives. If we are going to ask for accountability from those who act illegally, we need to ask of that from our own government. Try to imagine for a moment that the only way to save your 8-year-old son from being recruited into a gang is to risk being separated from him. Imagine being in the shoes. Someone I met in Tijuana was a transgender woman named Sharon. She was seeking asylum because her own transphobic father tried to kill her. She showed me the scars on her legs and arms from the stab wounds inflicted while she was still a teenager. Would you tell that person to wait in line?
God, no.
Lex was talking about a reunification he witnessed. This was a young man named Brian. Last January, Brian spent his 19th birthday at the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego when he was caught crossing into the U.S. to escape death threats in Guatemala. He was threatened and harassed for defending his mother when he saw her boyfriend beating her up. He was followed one evening, last December. He was followed by 2 men who put a gun to the back of his head. Brian's life was spared by the grace of a faulty gun that 3 times refused to fire. Excuse me. Brian ran away, and he spent last Christmas on a bus somewhere between Mexico City and Tijuana. When he was detained by U.S. immigration, our government attempted to profit from his and his mother's suffering and set his bail at $25,000. An immigrant, a refugee, who fulfilled all of the credible fear requirements, who did not have a criminal record, $25,000 to get out. He was lucky. He was lucky to have a very good lawyer who lowered his bail to $1,500. But he is one of the very few lucky ones that get out. Most people are detained and they don't know when they're getting out. I met a person who was in a detention camp for 2 years who finally gave up and signed a voluntary deportation order. 2 years in a detention camp. So I want us, next time that we're having a conversation about immigration, I want to urge you not to frame it as a political conversation. We tend to think that talking about politics is difficult. We don't want to talk about politics on the Thanksgiving table or on the dinner table. But we're not going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about compassion, and we're going to talk about humanity. Because our laws change, and our political movements change. But
Detention camps, and this is part of a larger event. This is a month-long protest. There's been different community groups that have been coming out and, protesting outside of ICE every day of this month. So we're the last group, and there's been poets, there's been musicians, there's been health workers, just different community groups every day. And so, today is the last day, Journalists Against Camps, and tomorrow, Saturday, the 31st, there's going to be a great event culminating all this series of protests that we've been having this month.
Why do you think it's important for journalists in particular to speak up against
I think there's a statement to be made from a group of people that are always told to be neutral.
Start that over again.
I think there's a statement to be made when it's a group of people that are generally expected to be neutral, to be objective, to be unreacting, and to say, there's a moment, there's a time and a place for objectivity, but there's an exception too. And this time right now we're living, it's an emergency. It's an emergency of Latinos and people of color and immigrants being persecuted, being made to live in fear. So I think it's really important for a group of people that generally have to keep our opinions to ourselves to take a day to come out and say, there's a time to be neutral, but right now it's time to speak up.
Yeah, do you think there's a difference between, a distinction between objectivity and neutrality? Like, is there objectively something you can say is wrong about these camps versus like staying neutral and keeping your opinion to yourself?
I mean, I think you make a really good point, because I'm just addressing it that way because I know that question is going to come up of objectivity. But I also feel that objectively it's a bad thing to put babies in concentration camps and separate them from their mothers. I think that shouldn't be a radical thing to say. I think it's not a political perspective. I'm not trying to give you a political opinion. This is a human conversation. This is not a conversation about laws or about politics. It's a conversation about humanity and about compassion, or at least it should be.
There's new news, often horrific news coming out about these camps pretty much every day. Is there something in the past week or so that has particularly struck you that made you say, all right, enough, we're going to go to the streets?
I mean, it's just been a whole environment, you know, the camps, the raids, the broken immigration system, the people that are stuck in border towns waiting for their asylum, being in this state of migration purgatory, basically, where they can't go back home and they can't come here. So it's a whole soup of this toxic environment. And, you know, we're not just here to fight detention camps or to fight family separations. You know, we have to be here to fight racism. We have to be here to fight a broken immigration system. We have to fight against the fact that even citizens now are afraid to walk outside without a passport because we look Latino, or we're afraid to answer a phone call in Spanish in public because somebody might harass me, you know? So I don't know if it's any one thing, but it's been escalating, and I think as a country we've kept this problem of racism kind of buried, and I feel like this is a culmination of that, and it's starting to bubble up, and this is just a symptom of that problem. I feel like the real problem is racism, and we're just fighting some of the symptoms right now.
This is the day where reporters are going to come out and take their stand. What do you think reporters and journalists in general need to do better about covering this? Or maybe if there's something you want to highlight as well about covering this issue.
I mean, a lot of the people that I know in this, in media, they're really dedicated people. Whether they're people that come out and say their opinion, or whether they have to remain quiet about their opinion. Everybody that I personally know is so dedicated and personally affected by this. You know, we're journalists, but we're human beings first. We were people before we were journalists, you know, and that doesn't go away. So I'm really proud of everybody here that's putting themselves out there and opening themselves up really to criticism, to stand together and make a point.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
I'm Henry Norr. Worked at the San Francisco Chronicle until I was fired in 2003. But I just wanted to tell you about a case that's going on now at the Chronicle. A woman who's a news photographer, worked there for 25 or 30 years. She had a company car. All the news photographers are issued company cars so they can race to a fire or whatever breaking news. And her car was parked in her driveway, and I believe, or some in her house, and it had a lot of photographic equipment in it. Anyway, the car was stolen and ransacked, and the equipment, the photography stuff was stolen, and they're blaming her. And they gave her some penalty, I think put a last and final warning in her record, and I think they docked her pay for a week or something. I don't remember exactly the penalty. I do remember the last and final warning letter. It's really an outrage. They have no evidence whatsoever that she has any fault for it. They're just mad that somebody stole their car, and they're blaming her. It's totally insane.
One of the reasons you were fired was you participated in a rally, and how can a newspaper say that journalists don't have a right to free speech?
It's easy for them. They're the bosses, and they can fire people unless the workers find a way to fight back. In my case, you know, I told them in advance I was going to take the day off and that I was probably going to get arrested. It was in 2003 when the so-called shock and awe bombing of Baghdad began, and you know, direct action to stop the war. I think there were tens of thousands of people in the street that day, and I think 2,200 arrests or something. And I told them that I was probably going to get arrested, and I expected to be out and come back the next day for work. And I turned my column in. I had a weekly column. I turned it in early. You know, I did everything right in that sense. And then when I came back the following day, you know, I was sitting at my desk working away for an hour or something, and then they told me, well, don't worry about your column. It's not going to appear this week. And I said, why? And they said, well, they're trying to figure it. Anyway, so then they suspended me without pay, and then a few weeks later they fired me. But in my case, the real reason in a sense, I think maybe, I don't know whether they were consciously using, whether it was really a setup, but in hindsight, it's clear that the real reason they fired me was that the year before I had gone to Gaza and participated in the international solidarity movement, trying to, no, I wouldn't say defend, but at least distract the Israelis from the brutality toward the Palestinians to get in the way. And I wrote, when I came back, I worked in the business department, and I was a technology columnist, and I wanted to write about my experience or about Israel and Palestine. And I tried to write. It didn't really fit in my beat, so I went around to all the other sections and I said, you know, can I write an account of my observations and my experience in Gaza? And nobody would touch it. Nobody wanted to go near it. And finally, you know, I was I went to give a little talk with some Palestinian Arab American students at UC Berkeley, and you know, they said, are you going to write about it? And then I explained that I'd love to, but I was a tech columnist, and I couldn't, and the other sections wouldn't touch it, and I couldn't really figure out a way to do it. And one of the students said, you should write about Intel's, the chip company, their factory in Israel. You should look into that, and where it is and how it came to be an Intel factory. I started doing research about it. It turned out to be a fascinating story. Basically, stolen land. I don't know if you want me to go into all the detail, but it's within so-called Israel proper. It's not in the so-called occupied territories. But it turns out it's on a little piece of land that the Israelis did not actually take over militarily in 1948. There was an Egyptian army, which was actually under the command of Nasser when he was just a colonel before he became the leader of Egypt, that took some role, you know, participated in some sense in the war in 1948. They did is they marched into Israel, and they took control of a few villages, and they sat there. And the Israelis were unable, or whatever, for whatever reason, the Israelis didn't defeat them, displace them, drive them out. When the armistice that ended the war in 1949, they were still in control of two villages. And to their credit, the Egyptians refused to. There was no question that they could stay. It wasn't viable, but they insisted that before they would leave, as they were completely surrounded by Israelis, they insisted that before they leave, the Israelis had to sign a formal diplomatic declaration, a treaty actually, that they would respect the security and the rights and the property of the people in these two villages and a bunch of refugees from neighboring villages. Okay. And they actually had a official thing that was signed by the Israeli foreign minister, and it was appended to the armistice agreement, and the UN registered the document and all this stuff. And the Egyptians marched out, and instantly the Israeli military, under the command of Yitzhak Rabin, who later became prime minister, marched in, drove everybody out, leveled the two villages, and it became empty land, so-called, abandoned property. And let's see, 20 or so years later, Intel was shut because Intel was run by Zionists. It was their first foreign offshore factory. They wanted to build a factory in Israel, and they were looking for a site. And Israel said, "Oh, look, here's a great place for your chip factory." It's the largest foreign investment in Israel, the largest foreign employer in Israel, and in some sense, it's the foundation of Israel's high-tech industry, which has been extremely successful for them. So anyway, I wrote all. I thought this was a great story. Oh, and the killer documentation about it. Most of the information I found about it was from Israeli sources, and the real killer was that the foreign minister, a guy named Sharet, who had signed the document promising to respect the rights and property and security of the people in the villages, he wrote a memo, internal communication, to the Israeli military when they were driving out the people from these villages and saying, "What the hell are you doing? I just signed this agreement. We're trying to prove we're a respectable country." And this document was actually declassified. In the 1990s, they had a moment of relative liberalism, and they declassified some documents from 1948 and 49, and this document came out. So it was, stone cold proof that they, on the one hand, one arm of the Israeli government had made these commitments, and the other arm completely disregarded it. And so it was kind of a metaphor for all of the whole experience of the Palestinians. And so I wrote the column about this, and my editors, I was such a good boy. I turned it in early. I warned them it was controversial. I triple checked every fact and from dozens of sources, and I said, you better read it carefully. It's sensitive. Blah blah blah. And my editors in the business section were a little naive. They loved it. They thought it was great. They gave me extra space because it was a little too long, and they got the art department to make a color map showing where this damn place is, and which is stupid. It's just no actual information benefited. It's just a device to attract eyeballs. Now, I guess nowadays there's a lot of color if anybody reads newspapers, but in those days it was a big deal to have color. It's supposed to attract attention. I found out, I didn't know at the time, but I found out later, the very morning the column appeared in the paper, the Zionists went on the warpath. That morning, the Israeli consulate is right down the street here, I think on the street, and the head of the Jewish Community Relations Council together were in the office of the publisher of the San Francisco Chronicle, yelling and screaming about, I didn't hear the content, I imagine they said, I can only guess what they said about me, but they never found a syllable. Nobody ever even questioned the accuracy of one syllable of it. There was no, I had a absolutely, completely documented, and as I said, mostly from Israeli Jewish sources. So they never questioned the accuracy of it. They just didn't want it to appear. And because the Chronicle, because it was all right, correct, and because I had turned it in early and I'd warned them and all the rest, they couldn't fire me then. They finally told me that, well, you can't write about that topic anymore because you're not objective. So I said to them something which was true. I'm not sure I'm proud of it, but I said, well, I don't have any, because I was a tech column, I don't have any plans to write about that issue anymore. So they said, okay. And but it was clear from then on. There were lots of signals. From then on, I was a marked man, and that was in the that was in I guess it appeared in the summer of 2002. And in the fall of 2003, people around here may remember there were lots and lots of marches in San Francisco opposing the impending war in Iraq, George Bush's attack on Iraq. And I participated in many of those, as did many other people from the Chronicle. There's a lot of liberal people there. And
It's against the policy of the Chronicle, apparently, to participate.
It was ambiguous at the time, and there wasn't a clear policy at the time. I guess
They banned people from going to women's marches. And
so I didn't know that, but you're telling. I believe you. I think since my case, and as the contradictions have gotten more intense in this country, they've gotten more uptight about it.
Well, this idea of objectivity, what do you think about them saying you can't really take a position because you lose your objectivity?
Well, there's two questions. One is print, what appears in print, and the other is what people do on their own time. I think people have an obligation in terms of what they write, depending on whether they're a reporter or columnist, should be upfront about their views. Reporters have an obligation to, state the issue clearly, but there's always going to be a slant, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a progressive slant in objective journalism, as long as you're giving the facts, and readers can recognize if they can recognize your opinion, and that's not a problem. They can form their own judgment if you give them the facts. So, the idea that objectivity means not having an opinion, that you're supposed to somehow completely detach yourself, that's just not, it's not real, and it's just a trick to try to get people to not, try to hide their views. And
they have been successful. I mean, at this rally today, hardly any journalists were there.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd think there'd be more journalists here.
Yeah, for someone who's on the beat of covering the deportations and immigration and ICE, I have some sympathy for them because, for all the problems with the mainstream media, which is in many ways horrible, it's better for good people to stay there and keep their jobs. It's better for them personally if that's their line of work and they can't afford to lose their job. And it's better for the readers or listeners or whatever to hear.
Thank you so much. That was great.
So if someone's in that position, and they might really get fired for coming here, even for this completely harmless standing out in the front door of ICE for an hour. I have some sympathy for them. I don't fault them. But everybody else, which is, 97% of the journalists at least, they're not going to get fired. No, they're going to get fired if they come over here or wander over here on their lunch hour. And if they didn't come here because they were intimidated, then I fault them for that, because you got to push. You can't, just cower at every threat. You got to push back. You got to. It's fine for people to, if there's a real risk, to weigh the personal costs, that's why, as I said, for somebody who might really get fired, I have some sympathy. But most people who are just bowing to the, to this the power of the bosses, and that's unfortunate, because most people. They don't really they wouldn't really risk anything by coming out to something like this, and it's a shame. I mean, it's wonderful this month, these things, I don't know how many you've been to, but there's been an event here every day, and at least every weekday, maybe every day, many different constituencies, and it's been very impressive. I've come to 4 or 5 of them. Kind of wish I'd come to more even, and on the one level, it's great that somebody's doing something, and all these different constituencies are organizing themselves to protest these unbelievable horrors we're seeing on the border. But on the other level, like, it's pathetic. The ones I've been to, at least, they've had 75, 100, 150 people. And that's so few people compared to the magnitude of the crimes that are going on. And like, where's everybody? I know it's a hard time. People have to work and school and take care of their families and whatever. And not everybody can be here, but an awful lot of people could take the damn lunch hour and come show up. And I'm sorry there haven't been more doing that.